Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tunca Kali, Marketing and Training Manager at the SPDC. Today, we're going to talk about workplace safety and injury prevention. So we're going to talk about ways how to prevent injuries and how to create a safer workplace. We're going to talk about OSHA standards and a couple of other programs to help you with your employees and again, like mitigate the risks of injuries. So our speaker is Wayne Vanderhoof from RGR Safety. A couple of things about the logistics. So we're recording the session. So if you want to go back and watch it, we will share it afterwards. And also you can reach out to Wayne for the slides. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in chat or just unmute yourself and ask your questions. Hope you enjoy. And Wayne, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Tonka. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate everybody showing up today for this training or for this seminar to give you information on workplace safety and injury prevention. As Tonka had said, my name is Wayne Vanderhoof. I'm a consultant with RJR Safety, working in PA, Ohio, West Virginia, working with manufacturing. Plastics industry specifically is kind of like where I like to go, but any manufacturing company, and then oil and gas and construction. I've been doing safety and engineering for about 30 years. I'm just going to go over some basic information. Tonka had mentioned a few of these points, but I'm going to go through each one of these points in with a little more information. So we're going to look at what are the costs of injuries to companies, look at different injury prevention methods, different tools to prevent injuries. Just a real quick summary of the OSHA regulations and compliance assistance, the various ways OSHA can help you comply with the regulations. And then safety committees. We're going to look at just a little bit of information and what the state of Pennsylvania says about the safety committees. So, reasons for workplace safety. Why do we have it? There is always that thing where we got to comply with OSHA, but there are bigger reasons, more important reasons for a company to ensure their workers don't get injured or get ill from chemicals that they're exposed to, or ultimately get killed on the job. The idea is they come to work, they leave every day, after the shift, uninjured. That's what the expectation is. There's also, for company owners, whether it's the small companies or whether it's the largest companies on the stock exchange with the board of directors, and it's a moral obligation to the workers. You hired this person or these people to work for you. You have a moral obligation to do for them as much as you can. And one of those is to keep them safe on the job, keep them from being injured, doing as much as can be done within reason to keep them from being injured. It's good business management. And we're going to look at these reasons why it's good business management. Reducing injuries, reducing illnesses. That reduces the costs associated with the injuries. You're going to see here in a little bit the costs of injuries based on what the workers' comp insurance covers versus what does not get covered and costs a company even more. So when you say somebody gets hurt, that's okay, we got workers' comp, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal because there are a lot of costs that aren't covered by workers' comp. We'll look at those. The other part of it is if a worker, and there's many studies out that proves that worker morale is improved if they work in a safe place. You know, think about if people get hurt in a company and the company says, oh, well, we've got another person, we got another applicant, we can pull them in, we've got a whole pool of people, we don't have to worry about it, the morale is down. Where if a company cares about the employees and tries to keep them from being injured, the morale is up. People want to come to work. The workplace is a lot easier, a lot better to work in. There's worker and management cooperation. We'll talk a lot about with that with the safety committees. When you put workers and management together to work on the same objective of keeping the workplace safe and keeping workers from being injured, the workers and management can talk back and forth and see each other's point of view. Well, a worker has a complaint about this hazard. The management can say, well, this is what we're going to do for that hazard. And you can see what goes back and forth. Then they can talk, well, why can't you do this? The worker says, why can't you do this? Management says, well, we can't do this. And we'll talk more about that with the safety committee. But cooperation, getting everybody working together on the same objective. It also improves quality.
Hearing others is a good thing.
Say that again. So it also improves the quality of the work that's being done. There's a lot of in my case, in my experience, if I go in and I see that a workplace is working to be safe, never going to be perfect, but working to be safe and keep the workers from being injured, there's always that. There's always the extra of, well, they also probably have a good quality policy. People are following those policies. People are putting them into play. It's part of the way the business operates. So the quality is improved. And we'll talk about it when we look at the different costs of how having to get a replacement worker or work overtime or have one person to do two people's jobs decreases quality or potentially decreases quality. It improves the efficiency of the workplace as well. And we'll talk about that when we look at the iceberg. So a little bit of information about workers' comp. I don't sell workers' comp. I try to keep workers' comp costs down by incorporating a lot of this stuff that I talk about. Just a couple of things to think about with the workers' comp, just so you understand. Workers' comp insurance pays basically the wages and medical costs of injured workers. The premiums are based on a classification of worker, and it's also based on $100 of wages. We'll see that here just a second. Workers' comp, the wages itself, the rate itself, we can't do anything about the rate because that is, or the job rate. We can't do anything about that rate because it's a standard rate set by the insurance companies. They have an algorithm that figures all that out, and what the rate is. Where we can affect it is the EMR, experience modification rate, EMR. Different companies say different things, but we're looking at the rate. We'll talk about that in just a second. A loss is when an insurance company has to pay money. When you have an injury claim, they have to pay money. The idea is, again, what we can control is that EMR, the modification rate. If we can reduce that modification rate, we can reduce the amount of premiums that we have to pay or reduce the increase of premiums. So to figure out that modification rate, the insurance company, like I said, has an algorithm, a formula where they put a lot of different information in, and this is some of the major stuff. The number of claims you have each year, the severity of the claims, how frequent are those claims, and then how much money do they have to keep next year to pay for injuries that you've had last year. So that goes right along with the severity. The EMR, this experience modification rate is an indicator of a potential loss. They use this, again, this formula to say, well, if we put all these numbers in, this is probably what we're going to have to pay out next year. So that's how they figure what their premium is next year. When they look at these numbers, they use the first 3 years of the previous 4. So for the 2021 policy period, for this year in 2021, they looked at your previous 4 years, but they looked at very specifically and used the numbers from 2019, 18, and 17. So what you get is a rolling average every 3 years. Your numbers may change. Like I said, they'll use 19, 18, and 17. In 2020, they used 18, 17, and 16 rates. So it's a rolling average. So if you have an injury in 2021, that's a severe injury that's going to cost a lot of money to that insurance company, that's going to stay on in your rate determination for 4 years. Okay, it's going to take that long to get it off of your system. Okay. So as an example, the class of employee, and these are what your insurance company determines, and they have rates based on $100 per $100 of wages. I'm not so much worried about the code 5183, but if you have a company that's 25 employees, that is around $32,000 a year, which is about $15 an hour. The rate that you're going to pay for that amount of payroll for that classification of employee is $5.25. So your premium is $42,000 a year. These are just example numbers. So if you have an experience modification rate of 1.1, that means you're paying more than what the industry average is. So your premium, instead of being 42, is going to be 42,000, be $46,200. That's an additional cost of $4,200. If you go the other way and reduce your EMR to 0.9, you pay $4,200 less. When an insurance company looks at your company, 1.0 is industry average. So if you pay 1.1 if your mod rate is 1.1, you're paying 10% higher than the other people in your industry. If you have a 0.9, you're paying 10% less than what your industry is paying. So obviously, the less your modification rate is, the less you're paying, because you're paying 90% or 93% or 89%. So it's less than what the industry pays. So that rate again goes back to how many claims do you have? How many losses do you have? How many injuries? How severe are the injuries? How often are the injuries? So we have control over that modification rate. Each company has control over that modification rate simply by reducing the number of injuries and illnesses in the workplace. So, focusing on injury prevention. Injury prevention is keeping workers from being hurt. What does that include? And we're going to look at some of this, but is the equipment in good condition? Is it operating correctly? Is it maintained correctly? Do the workers know how to use that equipment? Is it the right tools and equipment for the job? Are there hazards in the workplace? And it could be simply lifting a ream of copy paper from a shelf, taking it over to the copier, or it could be hazards on a construction job, or hazards in a manufacturing plant where there's a lot of manual labor, where they have to do a lot of lifting and turning and twisting and pushing and pulling. Or it's in an office where people are sitting and typing for long periods of time, and they get damage and injury to their wrists and shoulders and elbows. So there's a number of different ways, a number of different types of injuries that we can have based on the industry that you're in. So the idea is reduce the number of claims, reduce the number of injuries. reduce the frequency and severity of those injuries. Another part of it companies forget to do, many small companies do, is to maintain contact with that injured employee. The longer an injured or ill employee is off work, the longer it takes to get them back to work. So having a light duty program or a return to work program is very important. One, that gets the worker back to work, and two, that gets them back to work productively based on the restrictions of the injury that are imposed by the doctors. But if you can bring them back to work, the workers' comp insurance does not have to pay the wages. So that's one less part of that equation that the insurance company can look at and say, well, we had to pay a lot of wages, so we're going to raise your premium. It brings the worker back to work. It gets them back to work more quickly. So this is the iceberg. Okay, if you think about at the top above the waterline, that is what you see. That's what we can calculate. That's what we can determine. And this is what's called the direct costs. An injury has two different things: direct costs, indirect costs. The direct costs are what the workers' comp insurance pays, and you can ask them. They will tell you this information for whatever claim you have. How much did they pay in medical bills? How much did they pay in lost wages? Any disability payments? That all comes into your insurance premium. You can calculate those numbers. You can get those numbers and see them just by asking your insurance company. What is hard to calculate is the indirect cost. This is the costs of an injury that are not covered by workers' comp. And there's a lot of those costs. If you read these, I'm going to touch on a few of them. But if you look at these, it's hard to say exactly how much production is lost. How much does this cost? So lost production by the worker, by the supervisor, by the coworkers that has to do an investigation. If somebody gets injured, there's going to be some type of work distribution or redistribution where if somebody gets hurt and they can't come to work for a week or 2 weeks, who's going to do their job? Well, their job's going to be spread out between a couple of other people. So you have 2 workers that are doing the job of 3. So each person's doing 1.5 jobs, each of those 2. How efficient is that? Is there a potential for less efficiency, less productivity? Quality gets decreased? These are potentials. Can you quantify those? Can you put a dollar amount on those? It's kind of hard to do that. If somebody's off for an extended period of time, there's training wages. So you have to hire a new employee and train them on the job. So that's work. That's an employee you're paying for doing less than what that injured person was doing. So there's costs associated with that. There might be property damage. There might be other corrective actions like we got to fix this machine, change this workstation. We have to buy this new tool. We have to train these workers or retrain these workers. So there's a lot of indirect costs that we cannot get a dollar for. We cannot quantify. And those indirect costs come right out of the budget. If you look at come out of the profit, direct costs, we can figure in the insurance premium. We know what it's going to cost on a yearly basis. So we can figure that into the budget. What we can't figure out is the indirect costs. So let's take a look here. If you look at, let's say, a foot injury or a hand injury, and these are basic numbers. There's a cost multiplier, and OSHA has put this together with Liberty Insurance, looking at claims and coming up with this multiplier. So if you have direct costs of a foot injury or a hand injury that's $6,000, the cost multiplier is 1.2. So we have $6,000 of indirect costs or excuse me, of direct costs, which is covered by the insurance company. You take that direct cost, multiply it by 1.2, and the indirect cost is $7,200. So the insurance company pays $6,000. The $7,200 has to come out of the company profits. So a company loses $7,200 because of a foot injury or a hand injury. A back injury, if you look at it, say the total cost is $2,100 or $21,000. Direct costs are $10,000, and that's paid by the insurance company. The indirect costs are $11,000, and that comes out of the profit. That $11,000 or that $7,200 or those indirect costs are below that waterline. The indirect costs that are not covered by workers' comp. Okay. So you can see that injuries reduce profits. And the more injuries you have, the more reduction in that profit that you have because of the indirect costs. So we need to control what we can, and that is the prevention of injuries. So the OSHA regulations, these are minimum required safety requirements, safety regulations. They apply to every employer. I'm not going to get into the explanation, but it's either an employer or an employee. If you have employees, whether they're temporary or from a job service or a temp service, or whether they're your direct W-2 employees, they're your employees. You are an employer. The safety regulations apply to every employer. Doesn't matter what industry, as long as it's in the United States or a territory of the United States, the OSHA regulations apply unless they have to follow MSHA for mining, the railroad, or the nuclear regulatory, or aviation, FAA. But every employer has to follow some type of safety regulations. The safety regulations are put in place by law, put in place to protect every employee. If you have an employee, you have to follow. If you have even just one employee, you have to follow the OSHA regulations as the employer. There are a couple of size limit things here, but OSHA record keeping, we're going to look at a couple of pieces of paper here in just a minute, but there is a couple of limitations as to when what you have to do with the regulation. Okay, so OSHA record keeping, when we look at the number of injuries versus the number of people and the exposure hours and your NAICS code, that's your OSHA 300 and 300A. We'll see those in just a second. Okay. The other two, emergency action plan and fire prevention plan, they have a thing in there. If you have 10 or less employees, then you only have to have an oral plan. 11 or more employees, it's got to be written. But regardless, everybody has to have an emergency action plan and fire prevention plan. Regardless of how many people you have, just a matter of is it written versus verbal. This is the OSHA 300 log, and I'm going to mention, when we look at this, we look at OSHA recordables, and there's a whole list of criteria for OSHA recordable injuries. But these are serious injuries. These are injuries that are serious enough to keep a person away from work for at least 1 day, or if they're prescribed medication by a medical provider. Those are some big ones. Another kind of a rule of thumb is if you're first aid, if you have somebody in your workplace trained in first aid and CPR, they give first aid. If they give just what they're trained to do and nothing more, then that's first aid, and that's not a recordable. But anything more than what a first aid provider would give is considered recordable. Again, there's a lot of criteria on that. But this log would be filled out by one person within a company to track, to log how many injuries you have that meet the definition of OSHA recordable. It's kept on a yearly basis. Okay, this piece of paper here, if you have 11 or more employees, this annual summary summarizes the OSHA 300 log. And this has to be posted so every employee can see it in your break room, wherever any other common notifications are placed for vacation or notices or newsletters or anything like that that company puts out. This tells a worker as far as how many number of injuries, how many number of fatalities, how many number of recordable injuries, the types of injuries. And then on the right, it lists information. And one of the biggest things is one of the things it gives a NAICS code, North American Classification Code, or Standard Industrial Classification Code, more so the NAICS code. But it gives the average number of employees in a year and the number of hours worked, total number of hours worked. With these, the hours worked, the number of employees, the number of injuries, we can get a total recordable incident rate. We can get a recordable incident rate. We can get a number of different rates and compare those to other industries or to other companies within an industry. The last part of it, the lower right corner, where it says sign here, is where a company executive has to sign it, showing that or acknowledging that they have read it, understand it, they know they have a problem, they know they have injuries, so that OSHA can come if OSHA comes and says, hey, you've got these injuries or these hazards, let me see your records, and well, they show them the OSHA log and they show them this annual summary, and the executive says, well, I didn't know we had that many injuries. If I'd have known we had that many injuries, I'd have done something about it. Well, having that signature shows that that can't be the excuse anymore. So these are just some documents for OSHA record keeping. If there are no injuries, no recordable injuries in a year, these will all say 0. All these numbers will be 0, but this still has to be posted to show that you had 0 injuries, 0 fatalities in the workplace. The OSHA standards, there are a number of different standards. Everybody follows general industry unless they fall under construction, agriculture, maritime, or longshoring. So anytime you're looking at, anytime your company has to do any work, they have to know what the regulations are, and it would be 29 CFR is the OSHA regulations, specifically again, general industry, construction, agriculture is a farm, maritime and longshoring is shipbuilding and working on the river and marine terminals. So depending on what type of industry you're in, then you have to follow the OSHA regulations. And again, everybody follows general industry unless you can say, well, I am in construction, agriculture, or maritime longshoring. There's definitions for those that we're not going to get into. The last thing here is everybody follows federal OSHA. And that's what these numbers are on the screen. But these are federal OSHA regulations. Everybody follows those unless you're in a state that has an OSHA plan, a state OSHA plan. There's 22 plans, 22 states that have OSHA plans, state OSHA plans. They can range from being much more protective than OSHA regulations, the federal OSHA regulations, for example, California and Michigan, or they can be, but they all have to be at least as safe, as protective as the federal OSHA regulations. So the point here is, if you have a company in Pennsylvania, then you don't have to follow there's no state plan, so you follow federal OSHA regulations. If you're doing work, let's say a construction company's doing work in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, travels to, let's pick one, travels to Kentucky or Indiana, they're state plans. So you have to find out what is in that state plan. Is it the same as the federal regulations, or is it more protective? Do you have to do different? Is there different state safety regulations you have to follow? So it's very important that you know whether the state you're working in is a state plan or follows federal OSHA. These are some of the common OSHA regulations. There are a whole number of OSHA regulations in each one of these standards. for general industry, construction, agriculture, maritime, each one of these has its own set of standards. Sometimes, like construction, it'll refer back to general industry. When we talk about hazardous chemicals, hazard communication with safety data sheets and all that, the construction industry says just follow the general industry standards. Same, that works the same thing for forklifts. So there's a number of back and forth that you'll see in the regulations. So these are the common ones that are pretty common throughout all those regulations. Personal protective equipment, I mentioned hazard communications, emergency action plans, forklifts, aerial lifts. So these are common ones throughout all of them. There are some that are very specific to that industry. But in the general industry standards, there's even very specific industry standards for bakeries, laundromats, logging operations, grain handling facilities, electric power generation, transmission, and distribution. So there's very specific OSHA regulations for these industries. Compliance with OSHA regulations is important, but it does not mean that if you are 100% compliant with OSHA regulations, that you're not going to have injuries. But what it does is it levels the playing field for every company, whether you have 5 employees, whether you have 2 employees, whether you have 100 employees or 1,000 employees, you have to follow the OSHA regulations. Whether it's the state plans or whether it's the federal plans. But every employer is required to follow the OSHA regulations, regardless of the number of employees. So again, it levels the playing field. That's the minimum. You can go up from there, but you shouldn't go down from there. You shouldn't be less than complying with OSHA regulations. The way that OSHA incentivizes employers is through fines, inspections and fines, investigations and fines. And there's about 5 or 6 different types of violations, but these are the most common: willful, repeated, serious, other than serious. The fines range from $13,653 clear up to $136,532. Willful is the most. Willful and repeated, these are ones where your company was inspected by OSHA and OSHA deems that your company did nothing to protect the workers from a recognized hazard. They knew it was a hazard. Your company knew it was a hazard, but you didn't do anything to protect them. An example would be climbing up on top of tanks of gasoline to check the pressure gauge on top of the tank. You should know that if you have to climb on top of a tank that's higher than 6 feet, you have to be, or excuse me, 4 feet, you have to be protected from falling. Your workers do. If you don't protect your workers from falling, even though you know it's a hazard because they could fall, that's a willful violation. So these are examples of the violations. I'm not going to go into those too much, but you can see for one violation, it could be $13,000, more than $13,000. For a willful, it could be more than $136,000. It could get expensive. That's the compliance part of it. You know, that's what OSHA tries to make it expensive to, for failure to follow the regulations. If you have a fatality or a severe injury in the workplace, you're required to contact OSHA because they want to know, 1, for statistics, and 2, because they're probably going to come and do an inspection, or they're at least going to inquire into it depending on the type of injury. So all employers are required to report to OSHA any fatality within 8 hours of the company knowing about it. Any employee that suffers a significant injury or a work-related injury that requires hospitalization, amputation, or loss of an eye, company has to notify OSHA within 24 hours of knowing this occurred. The report can be made calling the closest office in southwestern PA. It's in Pittsburgh, call the OSHA hotline, go to the website and report it on the OSHA.gov website, report it online. You can fax them. You can go in and walk into the office and tell them. There's a number of different ways that you can communicate with OSHA, but it has to be reported. So it's not part of the OSHA regulations because OSHA doesn't have a regulation for safety and health management system. But this is what would be put into place in a company that covers all the different aspects of a safety program and injury prevention program that is needed. There's a lot of parts and pieces that companies have, but the companies may not have the entire system. And it's similar to a quality management system, the ISO 9000, 9001, all that. There's also the 14001, which is an environmental standard. They do have the ISO 45001, which is a safety and health management system. But these are some core elements. Management leadership. You got to have management providing resources and support to the overall safety effort, the overall injury prevention program, the overall system in place to prevent injuries. Having worker participation. By having a safety professional write rules and do training and say, you must do this, and the supervisor says, you must follow these rules, and if not, we're going to fire you or we're going to suspend you. That's not worker participation. Worker participation is asking for suggestions, getting safety committees, getting workers involved in safety committees, doing audits, surveys, but asking workers how an employer can keep them from being injured. Doing hazard identification assessment. We're going to look at a couple, or I'm going to talk about some resources here in just a minute. But doing workplace inspections, walking around in certain areas, walk through the maintenance area in your building and say, what are some of these hazards that we can find? What are unguarded machines? Where's some electric cords that are damaged? Where's some tools that are not in good condition? Walk through your office. Is there a place in the carpet where it's worn out and somebody could catch their foot on it? Is there a place where we have an electric cord running across a walkway? Is there a place where, let's see, look at your wall behind your printers. Is it brown? That means that the heat, it's building up too much heat there. These are some examples. Ask people, in an office, do you have any aches or pains? Yeah, my wrists hurt while I'm typing because I type all day. Those are examples of injuries where you do inspections and find these hazards. Incident investigations. When somebody says, yeah, I got hurt, I want to report an injury, do an investigation, do a review. How did that happen? How did this person get injured? What caused it? And then more so, what do we have to do to prevent that injury from occurring again? The next step would be to have, an incident investigation where somebody says, I almost tripped. Well, if they almost tripped, but they didn't trip, if they almost got hurt, but didn't get hurt, if an incident happened, almost happened, but nothing really got damaged, nobody got hurt, we investigate it, correct the issues, and that incident should not happen again. And then we have completely eliminated the potential for an injury before an injury occurred. Those are near misses or near hits. Having safety procedures. Most companies have safety procedures, whether they're followed or whether they were put in a binder and put on a shelf and they're just collecting dust now, or they were made 20 years ago and your operations have changed over the course of time. You've got new equipment, new tools, you've automated a little bit. You've got a few new pieces of equipment or a few new tools. It's time to pull those safety procedures out, dust them off, review them with the workers to say what changed, what do we need to fix, what changed, and how can we make these better. Another element in a safety management system is education and training, providing them the training they need to do their job safely, to follow the procedures the way they're supposed to, fill out the paperwork, participate in different auditing and inspection processes, and then having an overall evaluation program for the safety management system itself. Every year looking at it and say, well, what can we do different? What can we do better? How can we improve it? Because no system is ever perfect. There's never an opportunity, or there is never going to be an opportunity where we say, well, it's as good as it's going to get, because there's always a potential. There's always a possibility for improvement. So when we look at hazards, and this is kind of the basis of safety, the basis of injury prevention. What is a workplace hazard? We have to be able to identify that. Very simply, if there is anything in the workplace that can cause somebody to be injured, become ill, be killed, cause property damage, these are considered hazards. So you're looking at your equipment, your processes, the conditions within the workplace. Do you have wet floors? Do you have hot work areas? Do you have cold work areas? Do you have people that work in tanks in confined spaces or work in elevations more than 4 feet off of the ground? Are they in awkward positions? Do they have to lift, push, pull, carry between their knees and shoulders? How often do they have to do this? What are behaviors that some of your workers have that could be considered dangerous? Some follow the rules to the T. Some, they can't even spell rule because they don't follow anything. They do it exactly the way they want to. That's where you look at them and say, okay, are they getting the job done safely? Are they doing it better than the way we have it in the procedure? Or do we need to train, coach these workers to improve their behaviors? So we're looking for hazards. Hazards are what cause people to get injured or ill or be killed. Some examples of those hazards: slips and falls. Some of the stuff I mentioned, the manual material handling, lifting, pushing, pulling, carrying, those would be ergonomics injuries, manual material handling injuries. Do you have dust? Do you have chemicals? Do you have noise in your workplace, in your processes where workers could be exposed to those, which would cause illnesses? So you're looking for different types of hazards. Number of ways to find those hazards. I mentioned the incident reports, looking at those reports to see in the past what has caused our workers to be injured or become ill. We identify those and say, okay, those are what caused the problem. Let's fix those. Let's correct those hazards. Let's try to eliminate those hazards. Just simply workers reporting in hazards to a supervisor. Say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Supervisor, there's a water leak over here, or there's a hose over there. This machine's not operating right. Then the supervisor takes it from there and says, okay, let's get that fixed. Workers telling safety committee members. Safety committee members would be, again, safety committee workers that are on the safety committee. Everybody knows who they are. They should know who they are. That's part of the communication process. But workers will tell safety committee members. And then the safety committee members, only because they're a little more astute, a little more of a champion for safety than regular workers, they would take care of getting that hazard fixed, whether they tell the supervisor and start the process. Because believe it or not, there are some workers that will not tell their supervisors anything. Not about their job, whether it's going good or bad, or not about safety hazards. So having that safety committee member as a liaison works well as well. Doing a job analysis or task analysis, having somebody watch somebody else do a job, writing down the task steps. This is a good way to get to develop safe operating procedures or standard operating procedures, so that everybody does the same thing the same way, so that we get the same result, which would be a good quality product without getting anybody injured or ill. So we do a task analysis and say, what are the task steps in the order they're done, with the tools that are needed, the locations, and so that we can look at it and say, here is how the task is done. And then once we have the task steps, we look at the hazards, say, well, how could workers be hurt doing each one of these tasks each one of these steps. And then what do we need to do to make sure that that hazard doesn't affect that worker while they're doing that task step? Having walked through safety inspections, whether it's the entire safety committee walking through on a monthly basis, or whether it's having a couple of people from one from the maintenance department walking through the customer service area, or we're having the lab workers walk through the production area, and because you get a different set of eyes looking at different things, different hazards, different potential hazards, or just a potential for somebody that's not familiar with the area to say, well, why is that like that? So you get a fresh set of eyes, but you're doing a safety inspections. A good place to find examples of inspection checklists is if you look on OSHA.gov in the small business web pages, OSHA has a whole section on their website for small business. One of the things that they have created, it's a little dated back to 2005, but it's the small business handbook. For small businesses, this is a guide. It's not any new regulations, it's just a guide. There's 56 pages in this handbook. Of those 56 pages, 23 of those are self-inspection checklists. That's 40%. So there's a lot of checklists in there. And these checklists are just a starting point for you. You can take those, modify them, use them exactly the way they are, or you can modify them to suit your company, to suit your workplace. It's better than sitting there looking into space and saying, well, I have no idea what I'm going to use as a checklist. Wonder where I'm going to get that information. You have this as a starting point, and then you can just modify it and adapt it to your workplace. There's 42 different inspections covering a few different industries. And there's nothing that says you can't take the construction checklist in there and modify it a little bit, because that works more for your company than the general industry one. Doesn't matter what they are. You've got a starting point so that it's a good starting point. Some of the topics in that small business handbook. A lot more information on the safety management system that I discussed here previously. It also talks about developing a profitable strategy for handling occupational safety and health. That's going to discuss some of that, what's called OSHA pays. That's the multiplier that I talked about with the direct versus indirect costs. There's also a 4-point workplace program that OSHA has laid out, talking about, again, there's a lot of overlap between this 4-point workplace program and the safety and health management system that OSHA has listed in the handbook, talking about a lot of the same things: management and employee management commitment, employee participation, worksite analysis, hazard prevention and control, hazard identification, preventing those hazards from injuring workers, or if we can't prevent it 100%, we can control that hazard so that it doesn't injure the worker, or control the workplace so that the worker doesn't get exposed to that hazard, or is protected when they get exposed to that hazard. And then training for employees. And it's just as important to understand training for employees to know what the safety procedures are. But it's just as important, or more important, for the supervisors to be trained a little bit more, because they have to enforce those safety procedures, those standard operating procedures, those elements in a safety management system, those elements in a quality management system. So supervisors and managers need trained more than just employees. How do you document certain activities? It goes into the handbook goes into injury and illness record keeping. It goes into exposure and medical records, and how the differences between those and the requirements to keep the records for 30 years. Is it 30 years from the date of exposure, 30 years from plus the duration of employment? So there's requirements that you have to understand there. OSHA also has and provides small business assistance, really business assistance. First off, the OSHA Compliance Assistant Specialist. This is a specific employee within the OSHA office. Every office has one. They've come up through the ranks being a compliance, safety, and health officer, an inspector. And they've chosen to go into compliance assistance to where they do public outreach, but they also, if you call in and say, I have a question about this regulation, how do I comply with it? They will assist you as much as they can on complying with that regulation. There's the OSHA.gov website. And though there's a lot of the regulations are there, the most up-to-date regulations are on OSHA.gov, but you also can see a lot of training material, a lot of PowerPoints, a lot of handouts, a lot of fact sheets, a lot of cards, quick cards. The last part of it here, the OSHA consultation. OSHA has a requirement by federal law to provide consultation services. In Pennsylvania, it's through the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. They've been contracted annually since 1983 to provide OSHA consultation services to companies within Pennsylvania, all over Pennsylvania. They do safety and health consulting. They work for small businesses in high hazard industries, small businesses as defined by the Small Business Administration. They provide free consulting services. There are some limitations because it's free and there's a lot of people that ask for this assistance. There's one initial visit per calendar year. Now they can visit on subsequent or follow-up visits, but they can only have one initial visit and say, here's the problems, now let's fix these problems. The consultants that are used by IUP are either professors at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania Safety and Health Management Program, they're grad students, or they're consultants that are employed by the IUP OSHA consultation program. They are not in any way tied to the OSHA area office or OSHA compliance. They are consultation. It's a completely separate group. The one problem with this is that there's a backlog of 6 months. If you call them today, you're going to get talked to and get some basic information, but they probably won't come on site for 4 to 6 months. They have that much backlog. From experience in West Virginia University is the OSHA consultation arm in West Virginia. You can go to the website here, iup.edu, and then put in OSHA consultation. Dr. John Mulroy is the director, very nice guy. Worked with him with our safety organizations, but he is very knowledgeable and a very well-respected safety professional in the United States. But that's OSHA consultation. So again, it's free. I've had a few people laugh because they compete with me and consultants like me. But this is one of those, they'll come in and they'll help you out. They're very good, very knowledgeable. I know many of the consultants in Pennsylvania or in the western side of PA out of IUP. So very good opportunity to get help if you meet the definition of a small business. And then OSHA looks at the high hazard industries as where there's a high number of injuries, and that changes year to year when they look at statistics, as far as injury statistics. They don't change much, so it's unfortunately. All right, so safety committees. There's a lot of benefits. There's a few costs. And the benefits, I mentioned it before, workers and management coming together to work on one objective, and that is to keep workers from being injured. Whether we want to admit it or not, we have to understand that sometimes workers and management don't seem to work together. Workers and supervisors don't seem to work together on this objective. What they want to go one way, want to go the other, and management says workers don't care about safety. Workers say management doesn't care about safety, but that's because they can't see both working on it together. So bring them together, working together. The safety committee members, I already mentioned, they can be a liaison between workers and management. It develops trust and understanding between workers and management. When you can see each other working together and each other making decisions and understanding the decisions each others are making, instead of working in a silo, then you get a lot more trust and mutual understanding. When employees are involved in a safety committee, they own it. They can say, I put this procedure in place. I helped develop this procedure. I helped change this workplace. I helped buy the right tool or put the machine guards in place. It's ownership. It is, they have and feel more like they are part of the process. It's more of a bottom down, top, or bottom up, top down, let's meet in the middle type program, instead of all the procedures and rules and everything come down from management, and I'm going to discipline you if you don't follow those rules. But it's the employee has ownership. There's cooperation, collaboration.
Oh man, that came out worse. So they zoom in on their own.
Somebody have a question? All right. So to continue, it improves communication. Again, when you get management workers together in the same room, you're going to talk. That carries over out into the workplace. There's going to be communication. Communication improves. Morale's improved. And then one of the things that the state of Pennsylvania has is if your safety committee is certified, then the company gets a 5% premium discount above and beyond whatever other discounts you would get from your insurance company. This is just an across the board 5% discount premium each year. We're going to look at that here, the requirements, in just a second. Now, the costs associated with a safety committee would be you're pulling people off of the job to sit in a room and talk about safety, generally for an hour, maybe more, on a monthly basis. So that's a cost. The time to train the safety committee members in a committee, on the safety committee. The time that those people are off the floor, they're not producing anything. And then any improvements that are made to the workplace because of a safety committee, those are costs. But the overall cost is, there might be a little bit of cost with the time and with improvement costs, but that is overcome by all the benefits and ultimately improving the workplace, preventing injuries, lowering the EMR, the experience modification rate, lowering the amount of increase your workers' comp pays, reducing the amount of profit that you're losing because of the indirect costs associated with injuries. So you see the costs offset. And generally, when you look at, there's a number of different studies. OSHA has one that they use all the time. And for every dollar that is spent in safety, there's a $3 return on that investment. And that's information off of the OSHA.gov website. There's also a number, like I said, you can go to a number of other safety organizations and get similar results. The activities that a safety committee would do: training the workers, reviewing incidents, doing inspections, again, being the liaison, being safety leaders or champions, and then improving communication between workers and management. So that safety committee, specifically in Pennsylvania, the Department of Labor and Industry Department of Bureau of Workers' Comp. If you go to their HANDS site, HAND site, if you go to PA Department of Labor and Industry and put in safety committee in the search, this will come up. They have a very good workplace safety committee technical assistance manual, certification manual. This is, if you don't have a safety committee and you want to start one, you get this book and it'll walk you through step by step on how to get it started. It is very good. It has a lot of examples of the documentation that's required. The requirements for a state certified committee is it has to meet monthly. There has to be an agenda and meeting minutes for each meeting. The number of employee representatives on a safety committee have to be more than the employer. So it has to be employee heavy with just a little bit of management, just enough management to make decisions. There's a requirement for annual member training, but that annual training can be done virtually or in person, but it can be done virtually as part of the monthly meetings. There is an annual recertification for it. There's no cost to be certified or recertified other than what the company spends to get the safety committee up and running and continually to operate it over the years. And that 5% discount, again, is on an annual basis until there is no point in time where it's going to stop unless they change regulations. So that's being a state certified committee. You don't have to be a state certified committee, just you want to be a safety committee. Okay, that's fine too. But this is extra incentive to get the safety committees started. Another point here I get asked a lot is, do I need a full-time safety person? There are no requirements in OSHA or any other regulations that require a full-time safety person. It's all industry and hazard dependent. And I went through a lot of this already at the beginning. If you think about the hazards, how can a worker be injured in an office where it's an engineering office? Or what would the hazards be if that people in that engineering office also did environmental and they had to go out and do surveying or water checks or walk down pipelines out in the field? So there's some differences in hazards there. A warehouse operation, a trucking operation. But thinking about the different types of hazards in each industry. And that's a decision companies have to make individually, or employers have to make individually. I look at it when I give information to people, it's generally, if you have more than 150 people, it's really hard for a manager in a company to do their normal job and safety. So generally about 150 people or more is where I recommend companies get a full-time safety person, or one person that is in charge of safety. Now it could be that you get somebody like a safety professional that is degreed in safety with years and years of experience. Or you could get somebody out of college and that's got a couple years of experience, and they more or less they coordinate the safety program and work into it, and you use third-party consultants on an as-needed basis. So there's a little bit of variability there. So if you have less than 50, between 50 and 150, anything less than 150, you may get away with using a consultant, a third-party consultant on a contracted basis, maybe coming in, doing monthly inspections, working with your safety committee, reviewing incident reports, get the initial inspections rolling and get the process in place and then your safety committee keeps the safety program rolling. Your supervisors keep it moving, and the consultant is there just on an as needed basis. Between 50 and 150 people, it all depends. Again, it's all dependent on the industry and the hazard. So I have no real answer for you other than you have to make that decision as to, is it being an effective injury prevention program when you have a manager that's doing two jobs? Can HR do HR and safety? Can shipping and receiving also do safety and training? So you have to keep that in mind. So there's no real requirements and there's no hard and fast answer. So we're finished with the information, and we've looked at the costs of injuries to small businesses and how it reduces the profit. Hopefully you've gained a bit of an understanding as far as preventing injuries is what is key to protecting your profits. And we've looked at the EMR, the experience modification rate, the costs of injuries, inspections in the workplace, regulations, compliance with OSHA regulations, compliance assistance programs, OSHA consultation, and safety committees, including the PA Certified Safety Committee. So that's everything that we've covered. One last thing, there's an 11-question test, 2 minutes, or a quiz. It's an assessment, really. If you hit this QR code or hit start assessment, you can do a real quick assessment on your efforts or the results of your safety program. Are you reducing your injuries? Is your EMR rate lower or going higher? How many injuries have you had? So again, 2 minutes, 11 questions. It'll give you some information that you can use, or at least as a starting point. So with that, we can open it up to questions, either in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask a question. So there's no questions?
I don't see any questions, Wayne, in the chat, but okay, there's one.
Okay. So a question here: with so many workers working from home, are employers responsible for their safety and ergonomics while they are at home? The answer is yes. As far as if a worker gets carpal tunnel from typing because they're sitting at their dining room table instead of an ergonomically correct chair and desk and drawer and all that, that's an injury that the company has to pay for. That's a recordable injury that goes on the OSHA logs. So it's imperative for companies to send information to their workers on the correct way to set up an ergonomics or an ergonomically correct office. Some companies, and these are larger ones because I've heard Amazon does it, Google does it, obviously bigger ones, but they will send out, they provide a certain amount of money to an employee to buy what's needed to work from home. Other companies will just send, and I've done this for some of my clients, is sent reminders periodically as to how to set up your office, and how to set up correctly, set up an office, and how to modify, instead of going and buying a new office chair that adjusts 50 different ways. Is there ways that we can raise the monitor, lower the keyboard, raise the seat, put a stool in under your feet so that your feet aren't dangling? So there's a number of different ways to do that. But yes, a company is responsible for but the company cannot go to that house and do an inspection like they could if they walk through the office or walk through the manufacturing plant. That's one we can't do that. A company cannot do that. Some companies have done a virtual to where, and one of the engineering companies I'm familiar with, they actually had their their employees take their laptop and turn it around, or take their phone and say, you know, show me your office and how it's set up. And then the safety person would say, okay, here's how we can make changes. So that's another way that can be done. So another question, slides for the presentation. Tonka said that the video is recorded and it'll be put out on the website for the SBDC. But if you want to email me, Tonka's put my email address in the chat. You can email me and ask them for me. I don't have a problem giving them out to you. Another question, are the resources available to employers to assist in informing remote employees about how to set up a safe and ergonomic workstation? If you go to, there's a lot of information on the OSHA.gov website that will tell you exactly how to set it up, what the dimensions are, how to make the adjustments. The American Industrial, AIHA, American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA.com, ASSP.org, is American Society of Safety Professionals. They have information as well. There's a number of ergonomic societies, but I would start with OSHA's .gov website, and they have a lot of information, but then they also have a lot of references that you can leave their website and go to these other websites to get that information. Okay. Any other questions?
And Wayne, I want to remind everyone to fill out the evaluation forms. We really appreciate your feedback. It's in the chat, so please complete the feedback form. Any other questions?
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys staying on. I think we started out with the pretty much the same number, or we finished up with the same number we started. So I didn't drive anybody away, and that's a good thing. So I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, my information, my contact information, you can give me a call or give me an email. Just ask questions. We can start a conversation that way. So thank you very much, Tonka, for allowing me to do this presentation. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us or Wayne. And we will, again, as I mentioned, we will later today email the recording. And for the slides, you can reach out to Wayne. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.